Well, hello everybody. It's time for, I think, what is my favorite video that I make every year, which is my year of reading in review. I just love statistics. I love looking at all of my reading habits by the numbers. I love seeing other people do this, so I'm really excited, even though it's late. Finally, we're getting to it. Let's talk about everything that I read in 2018. So in 2018, I read a total of 146 books. Breaking it down month by month, we read 5 books in January, 9 books in February, and I want to note that I did participate in Feminist Lit February in February. I read 8 books in March, 13 books in April. Things to note: in April I was participating in Veda, so I was doing a video every day that month, and I also did a readathon, which was the week of graphic novels, which is my own readathon that I did during that month. In May, I read 12 books. I participated in the Buzzword Readathon in May. I read 6 books in June and 11 books in July, and Booktubeathon was in July, and then also the beginning of August. In August, I read 18 books. September, I read 14 books, and I participated in Contemporaryathon in that month. I read 16 books in October, and I feel like it's worth mentioning that I did have a big children's book spree during October. In November, I also had a big spree of reading a bunch of children's books, and I read 23 books. And then December, I read 11 books, and I participated in the Queer Lit Readathon. That was my year month by month, looking at maybe readathons that might have affected the month, and then my total reading, 146 books. Let's get into breaking all of these books down into categories. Starting with age range, 17% of my books were children's picture books. So I read way more picture books last year than I think I have ever really read since I was a child. Had a lot of fun doing that, and I definitely am already way more into kids books and like children's picture books in 2019 than I ever was before. 21% of my books were middle grade, which I always love middle grade. 30% of my books were YA, so I do read mostly YA, but it is pretty balanced. 6% of my books I categorized as new adult. It's not really a big genre, but I categorize anyone like in the college age range to be new adult. 26% of my books were adult. Next, we can talk about the publication year of all the books that I read. Of course, you all know that I was trying to read older books in this year, and Project Decades was a huge part of my reading goal for 2018. I am happy to announce that I mostly completed Project Decades. There were a couple years where I just fell short of my intended goal. Altogether, I think I did really well on this project. There were some years that I did way more than I expected to, so like it kind of evened out. So in looking at my reading, I think we're just going to look at like the 1900s first. So I didn't read any books published in the 1800s. I read 1 book published in the 1900s, 1 book published in the 1910s, 2 in the 1920s, 7 in the 1930s, which is because I read a lot of Nancy Drew books, 2 in the 40s, so that was 2 books short of my goal, which was to read 4 for the 40s, but at least I got 2 in. 7 books published in the 50s, 5 published in the 60s, so again, I was 1 short on the 60s. 7 from the 70s, 10 from the 80s, and 15 from the 90s. So I would say all in all, I'm very happy with what I did with Project Decades. And I read tons of books that I never would have read without forcing myself to do that project. Looking at the 2000s, I read 6 books published in like the decade of the 2000s, and then I did break it down year by year after that. I didn't read anything from 2010, but I read 2 books published in 2011, 2 from 2012, 2 from 2013, 4 from 2014, 7 from 2015, 11 books published in 2016, 27 books published in 2017, and 28 books published in 2018, which is kind of wild to me because like I really am not a type of person that's like got my finger on the pulse of the publishing industry. Like I feel like I have to read new releases all the time. It's not my goal going into the year to be on top of new releases, but I just feel like I accidentally get so swept up in people talking about new releases. My library, of course, is always like, look at these new releases that just came out, and I get excited by them. I guess I read like new releases more than anything else, even though that's not my goal. It just is what happens, which I guess is fine. And I know a lot of people want to do that. So if you look at like my whole map of year by year. I mean, it's still heavily skewed to like 2017, 2018, but I am glad that I read the books from the past that I did. Moving on to the genres of books that I read this year, I categorized 5% of my books as historical fiction, 7% as fantasy, 2% as just like straight nonfiction, 6% as sci-fi, 3% in the supernatural paranormal zone. 8% of my books were mystery novels. I definitely got more into mystery novels than I have ever been into mystery novels in the past in 2018, and it's again something that is already carrying forward into 2019. I'm really into mystery books. 1% of my books kind of would fall under romance primarily, not a big genre for me. 4% of my books were thrillers. 2% I categorized as horror. 3% of my books were memoirs. 1% I put as survival, because I truly did not know how to categorize the book that I read that was set on a deserted island and people were trying to survive. So I just decided that was a survival novel. What genre would that be? I don't know. 3% of my books I categorized as urban fantasy. If you're wondering why there's still like more than half of this graph missing, it's because 55% of the books I read in 2018 were contemporary, which to me is kind of shocking. Like, I knew obviously that contemporary was my favorite genre and that I read it a lot and I really like it, but I didn't know that, like, compared to every other genre out there, it's like, wow. I read a lot of contemporary fiction. I don't really consider this to be like a bad thing because I didn't even notice I read so much contemporary. I clearly enjoyed it all. I mean, I was completely satisfied with the amount of contemporary that I read, but I do feel like it would be kind of nice if I branched over into other genres. You know, maybe a little bit more than I do. In terms of the ratings that I gave books, it's not really a surprise for me to see that bell curve once again, with 1% of my books getting 1.5 stars. I didn't rate anything lower than that. 4% of my books getting 2 stars, 8% getting 2.5, 26% getting 3 stars, 35% getting 3.5 stars, 19% of my books I gave 4 stars, 5% of my books I gave 4.5, and then 2% of my books got a 5 out of 5 stars. I am very heavy on the like 3.5 rating. There's a decent amount of 4-star books, which for me is a really good rating to give a book, so I'm happy with that. Not too many books I really hated this year, and you know, a handful of books that I really loved, so that's pretty much what I expected it to be. I did look at the setting of the books I was reading. 34% of my books took place in the past. 56 took place in the present, which would make sense with the contemporary books I was reading. 1% took place in the future, and then 9% were just, you know, like in a time or place that doesn't really have ties to reality, so there was no way to categorize them. Location-wise, the setting of the majority of my books was the United States, which again makes sense. I'm mostly reading books published in English from American publishers, which is where I live. So 58% of my books were in the United States, 23% were international, 13% of my books took place both in the United States and in an international country, and then 6% were in like a magical realm. I did look at all of the countries that were represented in the books that I read, which I thought was really interesting. United States, obviously, Jamaica, Russia, the United Kingdom, India, France, Saudi Arabia, Puerto Rico. The Sahara Desert was a location for one of my books, but it didn't say what country, so like I don't know, but I'm just mentioning that. Canada, Mexico, Cuba, China, Japan, Pakistan, Belgium, an unknown island somewhere, bringing it back to that Stranded on a Desert Island book that I read, Sweden, Singapore. I did read a couple books that were set in Africa, so I did read a book set in Egypt, and then Germany, the Philippines, Vietnam, Spain, St. Thomas, like part of the US Virgin Islands, Norway, and Monaco. So I thought it was really cool to be able to like map out everywhere in the world that I covered in my reading. Let's talk about diversity in the literature that I read in 2018. For starters, looking at sexual orientation, 17% of my books had a queer protagonist. 14% of my books had a prominent secondary character who was queer as like the most representation in the book. 39% of the books I read had a protagonist who was a person of color. 45% of the books I read were written by an author of color. So at the beginning of the year, I was still doing my whole project where out of every 5 books I read, only 1 could be written by a white author. And I finished that maybe almost halfway through the year, and so after that I did start reading a lot more white authors than I had been at the beginning of the year, which I knew would happen. It is disappointing that I so quickly fell back into reading mostly white authors, and again, I've already seen in 2019 from where we are right now that I need to focus more again on reading people of color, because it doesn't happen if you're not making a very deliberate effort to do so because of the way that the book industry is skewed. It's bad. 12% of the books I read had significant representation of someone with a mental illness, and 11% of my books had significant representation with someone with a disability. I have found it very difficult to find disability representation in fiction. Some general stats about the books that I read: 4% of them were translated. I would love that to be higher. I didn't read any poetry collections, which truly bums me out, and I just feel bad about that. I did read 2 books that were written in verse, which is like not even a significant amount of my reading whatsoever. I read 4 essay collections, 5 books of short stories. 7 of my books were nonfiction. I didn't read any plays. I would like to read more plays. 13% of the books I read this year were graphic novels. It was pretty heavily skewed onto like the novel, just regular old book side of things. 24% of my books were owned by me before I read them. Honestly, even more than I expected it to be, because I mostly just read books from my library. In terms of the format in which I read all of the books, 25% of the books I read were physical. Pretty much covers many of the graphic novels and children's books that I read. 5% of the books I read were ebooks, which again, pretty much just graphic novels. And then 70% of the books that I read were audiobooks. This is who I am. I listen to audiobooks all the time. In taking a look at gender, 56% of the books I read were a female author writing a female perspective, which is not surprising. I definitely gravitate toward female authors and female protagonists. 14% of my books were female authors writing a male perspective. 18% of my books were a male author writing a male perspective, and then 12% of my books were a male author writing a female perspective. Some of these books were multiple protagonists, but I tried to do like what the primary perspective was for each book. Of all of the authors that I read, 52% of them I had previously read in the past when I picked up their book, and then 48% were new to me authors, which I think is interesting. It's almost a halfway split. I also always look at repeat authors for the year. All of the authors that I read a total of 2 books from include Maureen Johnson, James Baldwin, Agatha Christie, Brian K. Vaughan, Erica L. Sanchez, which I'm counting because I read 1 book by her twice in the year, John Allison, Max Sarin, Neil Gaiman, Madeline L'Engle, Tommy DePaula, William Steig, and Aisha Saeed. Authors that I read a total of 3 books from include Nina LaCour, Taylor Jenkins Reid, Barbara Robinson, and Sid Hoff. I didn't read 4 or 5 books from anyone. I did read 6 books total by Carolyn Keene, even though that is a pseudonym, I'm aware. And then I read a total of 8 books from my top author of the year, which was Alexandra Day, and that's because I read 8 books in the Carl picture book series. I'm very happy with her being my top author of the year because I was so pleasantly surprised to reread those books. My statistics regarding standalones versus series were 69% standalone books, 16% first in a series, 5% second in a series, 4% third in a series, and then we dropped down to 1% for 4th and 5th in a series, a little bump of 2% for 6th in a series, and then back to 1 for a 7th and 8th in a series. I definitely feel like reading mostly contemporary fiction goes along with a lot more standalones. I tried to do a rough estimate of whether I cried while reading a book or not, and I did compile all of these statistics at the end of the year, so like after I'd read all of them, so I was just going off of memory with all of these, so that might not be a completely accurate statistic, but I'm pretty sure that I cried during roughly 48% of my books, and I did not cry about 52%. I'm definitely a crier when I read books, and I really like sad books, so it does not surprise me that I cry with about half of the books that I read. And I am counting like tears filling up my eyes as crying, like not like full on sobbing or anything like that. Looking at my year in review, some of the books that made me cry the most were Love You Forever, Nana Upstairs, Nana Downstairs. Those were two kids' books that definitely made me cry a lot. I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, If Beale Street Could Talk, The Kitchen God's Wife, Giant Days Volumes 2 and 3. Those surprisingly made me cry a lot. Giovanni's Room, The Closest I've Come, The Prince and the Dressmaker, The Beauty That Remains, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Slaughterhouse-Five. The Carl books also, surprisingly, just like every single one of them, I wasn't crying, but considering their subject matter, I was surprised that they just made me all teary-eyed. I read Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows the past year, so that definitely made me cry a lot. Anne of Green Gables, quite a bit. And I'm pretty sure the book that made me cry the most, my guess, is Tuck Everlasting. I cried like so forcefully when I read that book. So those are pretty much all of the statistics I have for you. A few other things I maybe wanted to talk about in wrapping up 2018 were going over my goals. I always post like a mid-year check-in on my goals, and for the past couple years, honestly, it is very indicative of whether I'm gonna do well on a goal or not. So to just really quickly go over my goals for 2018, I had the goal of reading 100 books, which I completed. My Project Decades goal was technically not quite met because I was missing one book from the 60s, I think, and I was missing 2 books from the 40s, but overall, I feel like I excelled at that goal. It was a rough start at the beginning of the year, but by the end of it, I was really happy with how it turned out, so I would consider that to be a success. My goal of reading and reviewing 5 books that were sent to me for review is like almost met, but I don't think I quite made it. My goal of making a video per week definitely did not happen. That's honestly hilarious. My goal of participating in VEDA, however, I did complete. I'm still happy about that. And then my last goal was to unhaul the same amount or more books than I had unhauled in 2017. And I had unhauled 75 books in 2017, and I really thought I was going to hit that number again. I truly don't know what I was thinking. I did not unhaul anywhere close to the amount of books that I unhauled in 2017. But I will say, in my defense, I also hauled 171 books, and I, again, was not even close to that. So I didn't do as much detriment to my growing stacks of books as I could have. But technically that was a failed goal. And I am going to address that in a video that's going to be separate with my 2019 goals. I think that my approach for unhauling books is a lot better. I've worked it out a little bit better, so I will talk about that in that video. And then the last thing that I have to talk about for a year in review is my favorite and least favorite books of the year. I know that most people are really into doing like big lists of their favorite and least favorite books of the year, and for some reason that just does not excite me very much. And I don't know, I have never really felt the pull to do like a huge extravaganza of like my favorite and least favorite books of the year. But I know that that's something people like to hear, so to just give you a quick idea of what my favorite and least favorite titles were in 2018. Books that disappointed me: Tantalized by Cynthia Leitich Smith, not good. Shoplifter by Michael Cho, I believe, is the author of that one. I didn't really like. Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn was a huge disappointment for me. Sam and Ilsa's Last Hurrah by Rachel Cohn and David Levithan. Julius by Sid Hoff. Best Nest, The Secret Garden, major disappointment. And then probably my least favorite book of the year was The One Memory of Flora Banks. I read that right at the end of the year. It was just, I hated it. I think it was my most lowly rated book of the whole year. In terms of my favorite books that I read, I loved Matilda. I really loved Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. I read that like way back in February, I think. That book has remained one of my favorites of the whole year. I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, by Erica L. Sanchez I loved so much that I read twice in the same year, which I don't do very often. Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour. I'm Not Missing by Carrie Fountain. The Carl series by Alexandra Day. I mentioned this already now a couple times in this video. I really loved that children's book series. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery was also so good. And then my two favorite books, these are the only two books I think that I gave 5 out of 5 stars to that weren't rereads, were Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt and An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. Oh, those were just so good. Those are my two favorite books of the year. I believe that's it. That was my year in review, 2018 in books. I hope you enjoyed this. Really curious how your year stacked up to mine, things that we had in common or not. What do you think of any of these statistics or lists? Anything you have to say to me, love to discuss it. I'm so glad to finally have this finished and we can like move into 2019. Thank you so much. Love you very much. Bye.